Okay, now this is something I do semi-jokingly because it's not actually true of all Klingons, but I often make the comment that Klingons as a whole are actually less honorable than Romulans because Romulans are honest about whether they're stabbing you in the back, and they don't go through the pretense of doing public ceremonies about how they're good and moral, upstanding people who you should consider to be good and moral, upstanding people. They're like, oh, yeah, well, we did that. Sorry. Sucks to be you now. And this episode is one of the most egregious examples of Klingons being utter targs. Anyways, though, so how would you do this in a TTRPG? One of the key things about this in a TTRPG is the whole political dynamics thing. Because when you're in a TTRPG and you're not doing the murder hobo approach, which quite frankly Star Trek Adventures really doesn't favor the murder hobo approach to anything. If you're not being a murder hobo, then you have reasons to negotiate with NPCs. And if those NPCs don't like each other, well, that changes the whole negotiation aspect. And in this episode, it really brings that to the forefront because yes, there's the whole stuff with Kurn and Riker and having a Klingon as part of the crew, and you could actually RP that rather nicely. It's like the Federation players have a Klingon NPC who is attempting to assist them with whatever tasks, and have the GM play the Klingon, or maybe even have a player play the Klingon if they're actually going to RP being a Klingon properly. But that is where things get interesting because Kern's not the only Klingon. You have the entire Klingon High Council show up in here. And that is because the fact that Kern is Worf's only, well, brother. Yeah, Worf has Kern as a brother, and all of his ancestors, as far as I know, are dead. Doesn't have any uncles or aunts or nephews or cousins. So we have Kern, Worf, and Alexander at this point as the sole surviving descendants of the House of Moog, because the rest of them got wiped out. Now, this is the part where things get weird, though, is because the fact that due to Klingon politics, they decide that they're going to go with Duras' take on things, and it's just one of those things where it's just, why? Again, is that one of the things with this episode is that the Klingon High Council cares about politics more than they actually care about whether Duras is telling the truth. And that is the thing about this one that is particularly interesting. Because they do the whole thing of like forcing Worf to accept this commendation because otherwise Kern is going to get executed? Yeah. It's really stupid. To me, anyways. But it's one of those Klingon culture things. It's just, it's that if you're really going to go hardcore deep into the weeds of Klingon culture, this is part of it. Would you actually want to go with this particular aspect of it? Maybe not. But it's an aspect that you need to think about. And honestly, it's like the entire point of the episode. Now, as for writing the actual diplomatic / political stuff, If you're not doing Klingons, that changes the nature of the negotiations because Romulans are going to have different rules for political shenanigans than Klingons are. Granted, Romulans are still going to lie to you, the same as Klingons are, just that the Romulans are going to do it differently. And they're not going to publicly call you a dishonorable targ and try to have you executed for treason because of that. I mean, they might try to have you executed for some reason or other, but the rationale behind it would be different because Romulans handle that differently. To be honest, though, you look at the actual depth of plot in this one, it's not that deep. It's mostly an episode focused on personal interactions, mostly Worf. And, it talks about the Kittimer massacre and this and that and the other. And that is where one of the key aspects of the whole, like, this commendation thing is that Duras is lying, and several people in the High Council both know it and can prove it, but choose to ignore it. That I personally feel to be particularly strange. It's like, why exactly is that the case? Um, hmm, Good question. Also, why do Klingons, of all people, have a ceremonial weapon of an assassin? Yeah, that's an aspect of Klingon culture that rarely gets talked about and is poorly understood in general. A ceremonial assassin's dagger. Hmm. Also, seriously, that's a very broad blade. Twisting that while it's inside a target, that would take exceptional strength. I mean, it's also technically not, that the sole use for this knife. It's something that that assassins like to use. Anyway, though, kind of a weird twist for Klingons. See, yeah, that's the other thing with Klingons is that culturally Klingons are actually very complicated because they have a lot of things in their culture that are seemingly contradictions where yes, it does actually kind of sort of work as a cohesive whole, but only when looked at from a certain perspective, and sometimes you have to change perspectives to make it make sense. Anyways, so yeah, this is one of those things where it's just a matter of trying to figure out how you want the story to end before you start telling the story because you need to establish character motivations for NPCs before you have the players interact with them. You can't just roll dice to decide what the NPCs want. Granted, you're going to end up rolling dice as part of the story, but it's like here, it's like Duras. Duras wants to pin the blame for the Kittimer massacre on the House of Moog and brand Moog a traitor. Well, how many people in the Klingon Empire actually know the truth? Well, not many. How many of them? Well, that's the other thing, though, is that what proof does Duras have? Not much. That's the other thing about this, though, is that also, Kittimer, the reasons the Romulans did this are actually particularly hard to understand. Yeah, because like there's supposedly an ally. It's like, oh no, why are they? Oh yeah. Also, it was actually Gerard who was the traitor, not uh Worf's father. And the the defense codes let them turn off the planetary defense grid and then just blow the colony to bits. Note, however, this is not the first time the Romulans in this time period had attacked a Klingon outpost, though. They'd also done that to the Narendra 3 outpost. What was their reason for uh, doing that one? However, this gets to an interesting point with this, though, is that when you're doing political motivations, the political motivations need to have a root cause. Like this conflict led to, gave Duras an excuse for trying to get Worf and Kern executed for treason. But without that, he would have had to come up with a different plan. And foiling his plan was a matter of proving that what he was claiming was not true. And thus something that needed to be very carefully managed. At any rate, though, another thing that, well, this is actually so that the whole thing with the hybrid children is actually uh, a different episode and not directly related to the political shenanigans. However, the political shenanigans require the hybrid children to hide their heritage, because if they don't, the Klingon jerks will probably try to kill them. Yeah, again, this is why I say that Klingons as a whole aren't honorable. They talk about honor. They use honor as a stick to beat each other over the heads. They don't live honor. At least not as a whole. Some of them do. But the majority of Klingons see it as a tool or weapon or social status rather than an actual guideline for living day-to-day life. Anyway, though, yeah, let's take a quick look at this one. Um, uh, Narendra 3. Why did the Romulans try to blow up Narendra 3? Okay, so Romulan Star Empire and the Klingon Empire were officially allies at this time. The Romulans were treating the Klingons as barbaric savages because of the fact... Well, we don't actually know why. Eventually, the treaty was abandoned, but it wasn't abandoned until the tipping point of the Khitomer Massacre. Until the Khitomer Massacre, the treaty wasn't completely abandoned. The Romulans in the Narendra conflict, though, this actually doesn't say why the Romulans decided to attack the Narendra outpost. And I don't think the episode actually explains that either. That's another thing that I've mentioned previously, is that the whole like Romulans versus Klingon thing is mostly told from the Klingon perspective by Worf. And while we do have some additional information, we mostly just hear Worf talking about it, and trying to understand it from the Romulan perspective is difficult at best. Anyway, though, the Khitomer Massacre was the final nail in the coffin of the Klingon-Romulan alliance. the rationale behind it was apparently similar to the Narendra battle, in that the Romulans had decided to take over the system. It's the only thing I can think of with it. It's like you're literally just blowing the colony completely off the map. That makes sense if you want to tell the Klingon Empire, no, this is not your solar system, and redraw the map boundaries. Now, that makes an interesting question, though, is that one thing that we know about the Khitomer Massacre is that it's actually a relatively small colony. It's like, oh, how many people died? Oh, thousands died. Yes, thousands for the entire planet. That's the number of people on the entire planet? Yeah, the Klingons didn't have a whole lot of people here. And, yeah, that's another thing, is that it's territorial concessions, is that the Romulans were telling the Klingon Empire that this is our turf, kiss off. Which makes me wonder if the Klingons actually had a valid territorial claim to this system prior to establishing the colony. Because we have that whole thing of the Romulans being like, oh, the Klingons are horrible barbarians. But we don't actually have an explanation of why. If the Klingons were establishing colonies in areas that Romulans considered to be rightfully Romulan territory, and the Klingon Empire was not fighting to claim it, but claiming it in 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 a way that was non-diplomatic, and being like, haha, we were here first, kiss off. That would explain a lot about why the Romulans viewed their alliance with the Klingons as undesirable, because the Klingons were trying to exploit the alliance to land grab things that the Romulans felt were rightfully theirs, and use the alliance as a cover to avoid retaliation for their actions. That is an interesting thought. At any rate, though, attempting to understand the backstory of the conflict is actually quite important when you're doing political fallout of it years later. It's because if you, the game master, don't have it lined out what the truth of the matter really was, it's going to be hard to have players do an investigation into finding the truth. You can't just roll dice to make up the backstory as you go along and have a coherent backstory as a result of that. At any rate, though, yeah, this sort of political shenanigans is something that is. I'm not going to say it's a bad thing to write. It really isn't. It's just something that needs to be handled carefully. And I think that's enough on this one for this time. See you next time.